Welcome to Bay Area Psychology. I'm going to begin tonight's look at affirmative action by reading you a story from Politically Correct Bedtime Stories by James Finn Garner. Tonight's reading is Little Red Riding Hood. There once was a young person named Red Riding Hood who lived with her mother on the edge of a large wood. One day her mother asked her to take a basket of fresh fruit and mineral water to her grandmother's house. Not because this was women's work, mind you, but because the deed was generous and helped engender a feeling of community. Furthermore, her grandmother was not sick, but rather was in full physical and mental health and was fully capable of taking care of herself as a mature adult. So Red Riding Hood set off with her basket through the woods. Many people believed that the forest was a foreboding and dangerous place and never set foot in it. Red Riding Hood, however, was confident enough in her own budding sexuality that such obvious Freudian imagery did not intimidate her. On the way to Grandma's house, Red Riding Hood was accosted by a wolf who asked her what was in her basket. And she replied, "Some healthful snacks for my grandmother, who is certainly capable of taking care of herself as a mature adult." And the wolf said, "You know, my dear, it isn't safe for a little girl to walk through these woods alone." And Red Riding Hood said, "I find your sexist remark offensive in the extreme, but I will ignore it because of your traditional status as an outcast from society, the stress of which has caused you to develop your own, entirely valid, worldview. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must be on my way." Red Riding Hood walked along the main path, but because his status outside society had freed him from slavish adherence to linear, Western-style thought, the wolf knew a quicker route to Grandma's house. He burst into the house and ate Grandma, an entirely valid course of action for a carnivore such as himself. Then, unhampered by rigid traditionalist notions of what was masculine or feminine, he put on Grandma's nightclothes and crawled into bed. Red Riding Hood entered the cottage and said, "Grandma, I've brought you some fat-free, sodium-free snacks to salute you in your role as a wise and nurturing matriarch." From the bed, the wolf said softly, "Come closer, child, so that I might see you." And Red Riding Hood said, "Oh, I forgot you're as optically challenged as a bat. Grandma, what big eyes you have." "They have seen much and forgiven much, my dear." "Grandma, what a big nose you have, only relatively, of course, and certainly attractive in its own way." "It has smelled much and forgiven much, my dear." "Grandma, what big teeth you have." And the wolf said, "I am happy with who I am and what I am," and he leaped out of bed. He grabbed Red Riding Hood in his claws, intent on devouring her. Red Riding Hood screamed, not out of alarm at the wolf's apparent tendency toward cross-dressing, but because of his willful invasion of her personal space. Her screams were heard by a passing woodchopper person, or log fuel technician, as he preferred to be called. When he burst into the cottage, he saw the melee and tried to intervene. But as he raised his axe, Red Riding Hood and the wolf both stopped. "And just what do you think you're doing?" asked Red Riding Hood. And the woodchopper person blinked and tried to answer, but no words came to him. "Bursting in here like a Neanderthal, trusting your weapon to do your thinking for you," she exclaimed. "Sexist? Speciest? How dare you assume that women and wolves can't solve their own problems without a man's help?" When she heard Red Riding Hood's impassioned speech, Grandma jumped out of the wolf's mouth, seized the woodchopper person's axe, and cut his head off. Well, after this ordeal, Red Riding Hood, Grandma, and the wolf felt a certain commonality of purpose. They decided to set up an alternative household based on mutual respect and cooperation, and they lived together in the woods, happily ever after. I wanted to begin with one approach, albeit tongue-in-cheek, that has been used to cope with the rising and heated emotions surrounding proposed changes in the structure of many of our support systems. Affirmative action, welfare, immigration, even school lunches have come under the question, with fervor mounting as we draw closer to next year's election. Much of the emotional and political debate has focused on systems designed to promote opportunity, which have been criticized for, in effect, creating glass ceilings and dependence. Glenn Custrad and Thomas Wood have proposed a civil rights initiative, which they say is an attempt to dismantle a corrupt race and gender spoil system and return to the original intent of the civil rights legislation. The measure would ban so-called preferential treatment for minorities and women in public hiring, contracting, and education. We are fortunate to have Mark Guterman from Lee Hecht Harrison here tonight to share some of his extensive experience in human resources and direct experience with affirmative action. Let's open tonight by asking about your opinion about what might be fueling the emotion surrounding this topic.
I think it has a lot to do with the economic insecurity that people are feeling today, with all the downsizing and re-engineering that's going on in most of our employers today. My sense is that people are very afraid, and when they're afraid, the pendulum tends to swing sometimes in fairly reactive directions. And I guess my opinion is people are acting out their fear onto systems and other people who maybe can't defend for themselves occasionally, or can't fight back appropriately. Maybe they don't have the tools or the resources. And the way I'm seeing it, this new California Civil Rights Initiative, which I think is going to be on the ballot next year, I think it has good intention, but I also think it's in reaction to a lot of the fear that's going on literally across our society.
Yeah, and a lot of this fear is coming out actually in the form of hatred and strong messages, some rage. I mean, it isn't just a matter, in my experience, of people just feeling frustrated. I guess I'm concerned about the escalation of that.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that there is an escalation going on. If you look at last year's elections, if you look at Oklahoma City as an example, the rise of the militias and so on and so forth, I don't condemn all that per se, but I think there are pretty clear signs that there's strong reaction to the fear going on in our society. A lot of people, I believe, are not equipped to deal with this economic uncertainty that they're facing. Some people are equipped, but I think the average person today really doesn't have the tools or skills with which to maneuver in all this rapid and really very profound change in the way that we all make our living.
That's a very good point. You know, what I decided to do when I was reading this initiative was to do some research on my own, trying to look for the spoils that were referred to. And what I found was that, for example, when you looked at black hiring within public sector, it turned out that while blacks were 10% of management, they were only 6% of the entire population. Now, when I looked at that, my first thought was, well, then obviously then affirmative action must be working, because we're seeing a lot of management, some real movement in that area.
Right.
I did some more research and discovered that, in fact, that may be true. However, that there still has not been an equality in terms of pay scale or promotion.
I also think, too, those numbers could be really skewed because you don't know what kinds of management positions those 10% are in. There's a clear distinction between being a line manager and being a staffing manager. The line managers have a lot more power in whatever system they're in than the staffing managers. And I think if you look behind those statistics, you would see that a lot of non-whites are in staff management positions, number one. And then number two, once you go above, say, the middle level and you get to the top rungs where the real power is, I think you'll see those numbers drop off dramatically, not only for non-whites, but also for women as well.
Well, I know the U.S. Labor Commission took a look at this glass ceiling and found that 95% of top corporate management still remains largely white males. And apparently only white males make up 43% of the population, so there's a real disparity there.
Well, that's why I think a lot of us tend to jump on the numbers too quickly. It's easy. It's very easy to make your case with statistics, and I would caution all of your viewers not to read too much into the statistics, number one. And then number two, try to get behind that and ask some other kinds of questions about what's really going on here. And if I don't understand these statistics, who is it that I could ask to find out a little bit more about what's really going on?
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
What kind of questions should we ask?
Well, I think we should really ask what's going on inside our companies in terms of hiring, in terms of who makes up the various hiring pools of applicants, how do people get into those pools. If we have a white hiring manager, what is his or her track record in terms of hiring people who aren't white, and so on and so forth. I don't think it's a matter of quotas. You know, it seems like the thing that really sets people off on one side or the other is this notion of quotas, and I don't think that's really the right way to look at it. It's too simple, and it really boils it down to where you're missing the point. I believe that it's an issue of accessibility, it's an issue of equity, and that we need to continue to find ways to broaden out the pools of applicants, number one, and then number two, those people who are making the hiring decisions, whoever they might be, they need to be sensitized and groomed, if you will, to look at people who are different than them and maybe evaluate their skills, temperament, personality, values, cultural differences from a different point of view than we're conditioned to.
That is, you know, the conditioning is an excellent point. There was an article in the Mercury News, I think last week, about some research that was done in terms of people's ability to to understand difference, and that our natural tendency is to be drawn toward what's most familiar to us. So that if we don't have a picture of a manager as being a woman, or a picture of a manager being of another cultural group, that it's almost like we don't see it, as opposed to a deliberate attempt to discriminate.
I think that's, you know, my experience in corporations, that's very true. But if you look at a lot of the really progressive Silicon Valley corporations, for example, the bigger ones, and I do a lot of training in them, and I'm amazed at the diversity of people in them. But you get up above a certain level, and it very much goes more to a traditional white male model. And I think there is, for some reason, there is some blockage that happens somewhere about halfway up the hierarchy, if you will, where there's a glass ceiling or some sort of barrier. And it's very difficult, and I think some of it has to do with the culture in which these people in power grew up in. They just don't have the experience. Again, it's been my experience in talking to individual chief executives and presidents of companies that it's not a matter of racism or sexism or that we don't want to bring people in, but it is a matter of, I've got a business to run here, and I want to have absolutely the most qualified person right here and right now. And what's not said is I can relate to this white male a lot easier and more quickly than I can to somebody whose language that I maybe don't understand as well, whose values I don't quite understand, who doesn't look me straight in the eye, because I'm used to people looking me straight in the eye, and I don't quite understand what it means when they don't look me in the eye, and so on and so forth.
So we tend to be drawn to our comfort zone.
And right, and it's a real lack of awareness of how people and cultures are very different, but they're not necessarily any less valuable in terms of getting business done or getting work done.
Okay, yeah, so we're learning to appreciate the difference in work style and personal approach.
Yeah, I think so, and you probably know that one of the rages in corporate training today is diversity training.
Absolutely.
And it's very hot. My problem with it is it's way too superficial in most cases, and it's only a 1 or 2 day training. I think to learn how to deal with values differences and cultural differences should be an ongoing process of how we educate and train ourselves throughout our lifetimes.
So a one-shot hour isn't going to do it. We're going to take a break. When we return, we'll hear your opinion. Does affirmative action work? Stay tuned.